Well, 30 some years ago, I did the first book I co-wrote with another journalist called Circle of Poison. And that book was essentially an expose of how when pesticides were banned in the United States, the companies would export them to developing countries. And then, of course, the chemicals would come back on the food that we eat. So we're eating the chemicals that have been banned here and poisoning the people in other countries. Now, 30 years goes by, and I've done a book, Exposed, which is about revealing about what happened in America when the European Union systematically began to ban chemicals because of their toxic impacts on human health. And those chemicals are still perfectly legal in the United States. So we have now we've gone from being the dumper, which we were 30 years ago, which has deep moral implications as well as health implications, to now being the company that's dumped on because our government has not shown the same focus on these threats as other governments. No, I mean, it's such a sad presumption that Americans have that their government is off testing chemicals that could damage their health. And I'm sorry to report that that is not the case. In fact, the U.S., back in the early 80s, passed a law, it's called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was designed to ostensibly regulate toxic chemicals in circulation in the United States. But the deal that was cut to pass the law through Congress under intense industry pressure was to permit the chemicals that were already on the market to stay on the market without being tested. And so now we're talking like decades later, about 90% of the chemicals on the market today preceded the year of 1981. They've never been tested. And I think what that means is that every day Americans are exposed to an array of toxic substances that have actually never been tested for their toxicity. Although, number one, there's a huge amount we don't know about those thousands. We're talking about tens of thousands of chemicals. And number two, we have independent scientific assessments that's coming out of some of the major public health and scientific institutions in the world that are identifying the toxic nature of many of these substances, but the government does not have the power to act on them. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. I think the way to understand the impact of this situation is to think of ourselves as being the experimental mice in an experiment. And the experiment is essentially what is the effect of sustained exposure to toxic substances over time. For this experiment, there is really no control group outside of the United States. There is a control group, for example, in the European Union that has very different restrictions on these chemicals. But within the United States, we're all part of the experiment with no control group because we're all being exposed. And we are actually starting to see the results of this experiment. We're the rats in the experiment. Now we're seeing what the subjects of this experiment are coming up with. We see rising rates of cancer, rising rates of endocrine disorders, which many, many top scientists link to the sustained exposure over time to toxic chemicals. Well, the consequences on our health are registered in health clinics, hospitals, epidemiological surveys, in the form of rising rates of breast cancer, for example, which many scientists speculate have to do with the extreme presence of chemicals that are endocrine disruptors, that disrupt the endocrine system, which is essentially the nervous system of humans, or the active presence of actual carcinogens, suspected carcinogens, which are quite amazingly common in our world. So we are seeing the effects of this kind of toxic exposure in numerous settings, in rising rates of cancer. There's been speculation as to the declining rates of sperm in American men, meaning numbers of sperm, per test, has been declining pretty. It's in a steady decline over the last several decades. And one of the seriously grounded theories about why that's happening is because of the sustained exposure to chemicals that impact the reproductive system of men. And so when we think of this experiment that we're undergoing, we are subjecting ourselves to an array of toxic substances, and we're finding out what the results are. Now, what's interesting is that in the European Union, which has now banned chemicals that are strongly suspected of being carcinogenic or mutagenic, we are beginning to see, it's been about roughly 10 years since the banning of those kind of substances in the European Union. And so initial evidence, I can't say it's yet decisive, but initial evidence suggests that these kind of conditions linked to chemical exposure are showing signs of decline. We won't know for sure, for it could take 20, 30 years to know for sure, because it takes a while for these substances to build up in the tissue. But one thing is very clear that we know, which is that if you were to do blood tests, well, this has been done, kind of randomized blood tests of Americans done by the Center for Disease Control of the United States, they are finding kind of levels of substances that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, reproductive toxins, endocrine disruptors, are essentially in every American's bloodstream. And so the question of our exposure and our integration of these chemicals into our bodies is clear. Now the question is, what do we do about it? Well, I've been wondering, when I wrote Exposed, the book Exposed, and in the book Exposed I describe both the scientific evidence for the toxic impacts of a broad array of chemicals that we encounter on a routine basis. So it's the science. I also write about the different responses of the same science, the different responses of the European governments to the American government. So you have the same science. And in many cases, the European government policymakers were actually studying the results of American scientists who produce science, and science is an international field. People read each other's articles. And so many of the European policymakers were reading the science of both Europeans and Americans, as well as others, Chinese and Brazilians, and coming to a completely different conclusion than the American policymakers. The European Union went about determining to actually test those tens and tens of thousands of chemicals that have never been tested in the United States. The European Union has begun testing them with the suspected worst ones first, and they're making their way through the list, and systematically beginning to ban those that are really shown as being harmful, as the United States has actually done close to nothing during that period. And so I did ask the question to myself, later wrote about it in Exposed, the book Exposed, why this different approach? And I talked to many people, I read a lot, and I think there's actually, if you want one answer, there's different political culture in Europe than, of course, here in the United States. But in terms of the one most significant factor, healthcare. The European governments pay for their citizens' healthcare. If you go to Germany or Britain or France or Denmark or Spain, you have healthcare. And the healthcare is, for the most part, free. It's funded through, people pay taxes and there's all sorts of mechanisms for funding essentially what is a universal health care for people, and it's a very high quality health care. It's certainly comparable to that in the United States. And now if you're a government that's paying for the health care of your citizens, you have a vested interest in ensuring that they are healthy, because the last thing you want them to do is come down with some condition that's going to throw them into the hospital and take treatment over time and over many weeks, months, expensive medicines, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the main motives for the much more aggressive European approach has been the cost of healthcare and the desire and the seeing that in one place. So here in America, our healthcare system is fractured. It's even the government support for the healthcare system is highly controversial. Each state has a very different approach. On the one hand, so an American can look at the healthcare system and say, oh boy, this is complicated. How do we deal with all these kind of the insurance companies and these private interests over here? And over there, oh yeah, that other side over there is you got all these crazy toxic chemicals, as if these are unrelated, which is a complete illusion that these things are unrelated. And so I think the fact that the European governments actually are responsible for their citizens' health care had a huge impact in giving them motive to begin this process. And I followed the debate over some of the laws that the Europeans passed when it came to toxics. And repeatedly, in addition to what many felt were an obligation of a government to protect its citizens, was the cost of not protecting them. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. Even the top medical associations in Europe endorsed this measure. The top nursing associations all endorsed this because the cost to the government was starting to skyrocket. And that was one of the very powerful arguments. There are other factors in terms of the different political systems, but if you want one major contributor, I think that is why we have different systems. Okay, well, when we talk about CMRs, it's a C, it's an M, it's an R. It sounds like a horrible acronym. But a CMR is carcinogen, mutagen, reproductive toxin. So let's go through what each one of those are. Carcinogen means it's a chemical that is suspected of causing cancer or helping to trigger cancer. An M is a mutagen, which means it's suspected of causing mutations in the offspring of mothers who are exposed to certain substances. This means birth defects of various forms. R is the reproductive toxin, which means it damages the reproductive system of males and females in different ways. So the CMRs are pretty potent substances. And it turns out they're all over the place in American cosmetics. How do we know that they're all over the place? Because there's no law requiring that the cosmetic companies inform people if there is a C, an M, or an R in their cosmetics. The reason we know how many of these substances are in the cosmetics is because the European Union passed a law saying that they required, and that the requirement began, I believe it was around in 2006 or 2007, that the cosmetic companies needed to report if they had carcinogens, mutagens, or reproductive toxins, and then the EU could determine whether they should take them out. And so all this information came flooding into the EU authorities, and suddenly these things are cosmetics, which are internationally traded. We suddenly knew because the EU was demanding it and required that they take the bulk of them out. So then, because these cosmetic companies are basically international companies, we know that they have them in Europe and they also have them in the United States. That's why we know that there are CMRs in American cosmetics, because they were forced to take them out in Europe. And what that led to was a whole spate of examples where cosmetics sold without the chemicals in Europe are sold with the chemicals in the United States. And now, that said, I would say that most that I'm aware of the big name cosmetic companies, compelled to take the chemicals out of their European line of cosmetics, also took them out of the American line. So it took a couple of years to work its way through the system, but I think it's a reasonable bet that if it's an international company that also has a strong presence in Europe, that those cosmetics would not contain the chemicals banned in Europe. But if you're talking about a kind of a no-name or low-name recognition company that might be imported from some other place, and this is obviously gets to a big, profound question of equity, because often the lower expensive cosmetics come from places like China or elsewhere that are much cheaper. They are and they can sell cosmetics to Americans. They don't sell to Europeans. They don't bother exporting to Europeans because they can't get them into the country, but they sell to Americans. And so if you're talking about one of these cosmetics that actually comes from a company you don't really know, and it's not really international, it's imported from someplace other than Europe, there's a reasonable chance that there are carcinogens, mutagens, or reproductive toxins in there. Now, why does this exist? The reason it exists is because back in the this really goes way back, but anyway, back in the previous century, I believe it was the 30s, could be the 20s or 30s, when the FDA was created, the Food and Drug Administration. One of the concessions made to the cosmetic companies was that the FDA would be excluded from regulating the ingredients of cosmetics. So again, it was a deal cut with the industry at that time, which was a much smaller industry than it is today, with the cosmetic companies, which said, we don't want you looking into the ingredients we use. And they had their congressmen and their congress people to ensure that that provision was put in there. And that has not changed. And every time there's been an attempt to change it, including some efforts even as far back as the 70s, even into the 80s, 90s, there have been congressional efforts to change it. The cosmetic companies, personal care companies have fought it in Congress and stopped that from happening. So the point of all this is that chemicals that are literally banned from cosmetics in Europe, in products that people, mostly women, but not only, people use every single day. We're talking about everything from eyeshadow to lipstick to mascara to skin powder to shampoos and nail polish. If they don't have some connection to the European Union, could contain all sorts of toxic substances. And the sad thing about that is twofold. One is that it exists, that there's no American body that cared enough about our health that said, stop, we're gonna take this stuff out. And two, it strikes directly at the equity question, because of course if you have the resources to buy the more expensive cosmetics, the bets are reasonable that they don't contain this, because by accident, lucky you, you're protected by the Europeans. But if you don't have those resources, you buy your cosmetics at a lower cost place, there is no guarantee whatsoever that they don't contain this material.